And so that's what I'm gonna try to do tonight, is I'm gonna attempt to bring to life the diary of James W. Albright and his military exploits in and around Ramsey County. I will tell you one thing about Mr. Albright. He was a fan of oysters, because throughout his diary, he speaks of it on many, many numerous occasions. I went to find out something about him, and I went to find a grave, and there was his tombstone and a picture of him. And so I learned that his middle name, that W, stands for Washington. So I learned something today. And he was born there. He spent his early years in Greensboro, also in Asheville. He grew up in that area. He was a newspaper writer and an editor. And so he had access to the writing skills, the journals, and also the printing press that he had, because he was also textbook printer. He printed textbooks, and he had two friends that went in business with him, and together they were printers of the textbooks that they used in the schools during that time. And so a little bit about him and his life. He chose to, it's called, the official title of his work is called Diary and Reminiscence of James W. Albright of North Carolina. The original is in Chapel Hill at the Southern Historical Collection, and it contains a record of about 3 years of his military exploits. And he actually joined with the 12th Virginia Battalion of Light Artillery, is where he served under, and that was his group. That particular group, the 12th Virginia, the 12th Battalion of the Virginia Light Artillery, was organized, and it was organized in May of 1862. Actually, they divided it into 4 companies, and the best that I could figure out, he was in Company D, which was the Harrington Light Artillery, and it was assigned to the 13th North Carolina Artillery Battalion in November. And Major Francis Boggs was in command, and he was served as an ordnance officer, and so that was his service within the Confederate Army of Virginia during that time. And he saw action during the Peninsula Campaign, 1862, near Petersburg, Virginia, and then down in Wilmington in 1864. And so actually being a publisher, newspaper publisher, at the close of the Civil War, he was asked to, since he had the printing press and the newspaper, he had the ability to print. He mentions that he printed 60,000 Confederate paroles in Greensboro, and so having access there. The textbook publishers were called Sterling, Campbell, and Albright. And what they did, the fact, it goes on to say that textbook publishing is an important but neglected aspect of the cultural history of North Carolina and South during the Civil War. Instructional materials were written and published in North Carolina were necessary for the education of the Tar Heel children when secession isolated the state from northern publishers. It was interesting to read this, that these books that they published reveal much about how the schools, how the books were written and published, as well as to what extent they were used as propaganda to shape political opinions in support of the war and a separate Confederate nation. And I did not realize that they actually used the textbooks and what they wrote in it as a source of not only information, but of propaganda. So then, what about this fellow, and what about his journeys as he moves throughout the county? Let me begin. It's titled Diaries and Reminiscence, and a lot of times he reminisced. He would not do it chronologically, because I tried to sit down with the other books that, as he mentioned an event, I would go find the date on it and see if I could find the sequence. And so he starts off in 1864, writing, and now a little bit later on in the program, he's going to switch back to 1863 because of the way of the things that he mentioned. But let's don't let that boggle your mind. Let me just tell you something about this fellow. He begins by saying, this is January 7th of 1864. So there's where I will begin, but we're going to have to move back and forth in time. He says, Gregory and myself, he never does name who Gregory is, but apparently he was a pal because he stayed with him, a fellow soldier. He said, we went to Weldon, North Carolina. So if he was in Petersburg, Weldon is right there near the line. It's on the railroad line that ran from Weldon to Warsaw and on down to Wilmington. I called it the 3 W's. But he mentions that. He said, we went to Weldon where we saw the boys on board the train for Wilmington. So there was a group of soldiers heading down to Wilmington. He said, we went about a half mile from town and pitched our tents. It was snowing and sleeting. That was in January. Okay, on the 20th of January, he says we reached Warsaw. He says the place the Yanks visited last summer and burned the depot. We reached Wilmington after night, went downtown, but all the stores were closed. Never saw so many police in a small town. We slept in a boxcar again for the 4th night. The next day he gets up, he unloads his stuff. He said he strolls over town, which is quite stirring and businesslike. And he met several of the businessmen of the cities. He mentions the blockade runners that are in town. He says there are several blockade runners were in port, loading and unloading mostly foreign vessels. He said mentions the fact that things are much higher there in Wilmington than they were back in Richmond or Petersburg. He learns that Major Boggs, who was commander there of the Company D of this 12th artillery, that we learned that Major Boggs and Captain Young's battery had gone to Smithfield, and we know that is Southport, 30 miles below the mouth of the Cape Fear. So we crossed the river, being the Cape Fear River, in an old flat, and with the ferries that you've seen the picture of going across the Cape Fear River from Eagles Island there to the foot of Front Street, there where the marketplace was. And he said, we crossed over on that, and we took a line of march, saw several boys fishing, and they had some fine cats. I'm sure he meant catfish. And so he mentions about the boys fishing. He says in 2 miles, we crossed the Brunswick River, which is there at Leland. So you can imagine there as they're walking out of town. And he makes a reference that the Brunswick River is nearly as wide as the Cape Fear. Saw large numbers of wild ducks. Oh, he said, for a gun. And I thought, well, you're in the military and you're the artillery. Well, you should have been issued a gun if you're the military ordnance artillery portion of that group. He said, we camped 5 miles from Wilmington on a small creek. And I was surprised to hear the swamp ringing with the clear note of the little frogs. Talks the next morning about sunrise and getting up, and this is what he says about us. He's now in Brunswick County. Sunrise found us on the road, and I was soon impressed with the bareness of the land and the unbroken features of the county. The pine trees have all been boxed and scraped for turpentine, and we know the neighbor stores he's talking about. He said some of them seem to have been neglected since the war. He said, I saw a party of hunters driving for deer. We call it today deer driving, the same term, we just reverse it. So they're there, they're on 133, the river road, heading from Leland down towards Smithfield, and they encounter these that are out driving for deer. He said, I learned a good many things could be found in the swamps. They reached Fort Anderson about noon. He said, well, we didn't have time to examine it, so they continue on down. They get down to Southport about 3 o'clock in the afternoon. And they go to the Fort Johnston area, because this is what he said. The barracks, we found the headquarters in good health and spirits and comfortably quartered in barracks. The barracks and the log houses at the United States property, which was Fort Johnston. He said, we were garrisoned by a small force in time of peace. From the barracks, we had a fine view of Bald Head Island, and you can imagine them looking out from Fort Johnston over to Bald Head Island. He said there stands a lofty lighthouse, but there's no light coming out, no one to guide the troubled blockade runners. And you know the conditions that were going on, these little vessels that were trying to get in from Nassau and Bermuda were coming into Wilmington area. And so the Union then putting these blockade runners to keep, to try to keep them from coming in. And we'll talk about two of those in just a minute. He said several blockaders are now in sight off of Fort Caswell. One of them was the Advance. And the Advance had been beached off of Fort Caswell, and her cargo had been all gotten off, and it is believed the vessel may be saved. Well, it was captured later on. This was in January, and it was captured in September. So the Advance was able to do some moving of freight and goods back and forth. The Advance was the first and most famous of the 4 blockade running vessels that the state of North Carolina operated. And they operated in connection with in partnership with the Alexander Collie Company of London and Manchester during the Civil War. It was originally a passenger steamer that plied the waters between Dublin, Ireland, Glasgow, Scotland. The ship was converted to a blockade runner in 1863. So it was done that in 1863. It was captured in 1864. It had a year of success moving and running and being able to go through the blockades. It became the Advance became one of the war's most successful blockade runners, although its career in that dangerous business did not exceed 15 months, so a very short span. And as I said, in September, it was run aground. It was overtaken by the Santiago de Cuba, was the Union blockader, and forced them to surrender. So a little bit about that. And then he goes on to talk something about Smithville, and it was quite a fashionable summer seaside resort. And the houses generally are old and have an ancient appearance, but the live oaks make it a pretty place. He said, I learned we are to move further south here in the morning. Guess where he's coming next? Lockwood Folly. So now we're moving him he's come from Wilmington to Leland. He's past Fort Anderson. He's been down to Smithville and Fort Johnston. And now they get word they got to move again. And this time they're going to move further south. He said, I bought a quart of oysters and made for camp, which I soon cooked them and ate half. Jeff Wharton ate the balance. And I don't know yet who Jeff Wharton was, but apparently he appears again later on in another oyster roast that he holds. And so you'll see all these things that are happening there with these ways of eating and their food and they're provided for them. In fact, I'm going to end up telling you about sweet potatoes and how much they cost and stuff like that. But let's get back to Lockwood Folly.
Gwen.
Yeah.
He said Lockwood Folly is referring basically to what we call supply now.
Yeah. Yeah, it's going to be because he mentions they're 8 miles from the ocean. So we know that's about the supply area. Okay. Okay. So he said, we're again on the march to the head of the Lockwood Folly Inlet, 18 miles south of Smithville. So you know we're south of Smithville and coming this way, it would be south of. He said all of the staff is with us except the surgeon who stays in Smithville. The county is sandy, poor, and sparsely settled, and a respectable dwelling on the outside, and not a respectable dwelling on the roadside the whole distance traveled. So as he moves them up the coast, as they're moving inland from Southport and are headed this way. I lost one of my I had. So they're headed this way. And he goes on to say that, okay, this is what he said about the county. It was sandy, poor, and sparsely settled, not a respectable dwelling on the roadside the whole distance. This is to be the headquarters, and so somewhere here in the supply area was the supply, was the headquarters with all the coast from the mouth of the Cape Fear to South Carolina to operate in. Well, we know that was Captain John Wesley Galloway's Coast Guard that moved from Lockwood Folly Inlet down to South Carolina. They put them on the beach with horses, and they carried the Gatling, pulled the Gatling gun, and they patrolled the coast back and forth. And so this was Captain John Wesley Galloway's Coast Guard, half brother to Abraham Galloway that you're going to hear about in May, because they had the same father. John Galloway was the father of John Wesley, and he's actually a junior, so it was John Wesley Galloway. Abraham's mother was Hester Hankins, and she was an enslaved person. And so after the birth of that child, Captain marries, and then he has all the other children that are the basis of the Galloways that are here in Brunswick County and all. So it was interesting to know that little bit about who's going to be patrolling the coastline. It says it's 8 miles from the ocean, and it's the most desolate looking county I have ever been in. The people are extremely poor and ignorant. They believe in witches and spells. And then he says, an original character we saw on the roadside cleaning fish gave us a very amusing account of how a fellow put a spell on his sister. But she was confident it would go off in 2 more nights when the moon would be full and pass over a southeast corner of the house. He said, we're only 3 miles from the grain swamp, so you can see the position now of where he's located. And he calls and refers to that as famous retreat of deserters and the runaways. He said, I hope to visit it soon. Okay, so the next day we're heading on down. After they've made it here to Supply, he meets just Gregory again. They go off exploring expedition toward the coast, and they pass a church called Mount Pisgah. Okay, at that time, Mount Pisgah, which started down at Brown's Landing at the very end, had moved inland about where the Browns are living, about halfway up Stone Chimney, Hewitt Road and Taft Road, and the Browns that lived there. The church had been moved up there. And so as they traveled from Supply, they're walking toward down what is now today's Stone Chimney Road, that area, heading to Brown's Landing. They passed a church called Mount Pisgah. He said where a few people were assembled. And I asked him if there's going to be preaching. It was Sunday. But the man said no, but there's going to be a meeting. He said, I did not want to see what was meant after he told me it was a Baptist church. But he does say that the churches are more credible than the houses. And in contrast to the residents of the houses that the people are living in. On reaching the inlet, we found all the boats on the beach. So we amused ourselves by eating oysters and talking with the natives, who were very clever and communicative. A few hands had been making salt. You know, we still use that term today, or they did when I was growing up working in tobacco. We call them the hands, tobacco hands. The workers are called hands, right? And so this was a term he used. He said there was a few hands here making salt for the state. At that time, salt was selling for $10 a bushel. And there were lots of salt works in Brunswick County at Lockwood Folly Inlet. This is a book called Salt. It's by Isabel Williams and McGeechan. And it was written many, many years ago, but it's the best resource that you'll find if you're interested in salt works and what's going on in that particular interest. And in essence of time, I'm just going to read you one little short paragraph. At Lockwood Folly Inlet, first 2 works, 2 salt works now, these 2 separate things, appeared in the newspaper in 1863. In February, an interest was offered in a works of 8 pans. And so they had these gigantic pans, I would assume about like the length of a table, maybe double size. you can find, definitely the size that they were. And, they offered, and the person who's selling it says, I'll also, there's a, wood within a quarter of a mile that they would furnish for 75 cents. So they either did it through heat, there was that source through heating and evaporate. They put the ocean water in the pans, these flat pans, and they're about this high up. And then they would put fire underneath them and cause it to evaporate, and that made salt. The other way was just by the sun, the solar meeting out. And so this is what he's talking about now. When he talks about the salt works that were going on there. The oysters are very fine and good abundance. The whole inlet is lined with large rocks or beds of them. So he's got his terminology still down. He knows what it's called and all. This place is noted for a number of the wrecks, and we're talking about Lockefalli, Brown's Landing, more or less, and close to Arnhem there, where the Lockefalli River comes out now into the inland waterway. You got to remember, the inland waterway was not there until 1933 when they started cutting it through. So you got to remember that now. So there was no inland waterway going up and down. And so he said that there were the wrecks of vessels driven here in times of gale. He see 3 of them. One of them was the Elizabeth. And John Holden in his book wrote about the shipwrecks there on the coast. He says the blockade runner Elizabeth was stranded on a sandbar on the west side of Lockefalli Inlet, September 24th, 1863. So this had already happened whenever he's writing. The crew unloaded part of the cargo and set fire to the ship. And then he mentions Neil Holden, who was a resident and a soldier in the Confederate Army. He goes aboard the Elizabeth one day, it's abandoned there within the inlet, and he found a razor in the cabin. And some of the people thought it might belong to the captain. He takes the razor home, passes it down through the family lines. And so that was something that he had salvaged then from the Elizabeth. It was powered by 2 paddle wheels, one on each side. And said most of the paddle wheels on the side next to the beach were still intact. When I saw it, this is Mr. John Holden speaking, for the first time, and about half on the ocean side. Hurricane Hazel destroyed most of the remains there of the paddle wheel. The other one that he mentions is the Bendigo. And the Bendigo was a blockade runner. It created a lot of excitement when it ran aground on a sandbar in the Lockefalli Inlet. This is in January of 1864, so now keep your dates in mind. The Federal gunboat seamen wanted to salvage the ship and its cargo. Several attempts were made by the gunboats to pull it off the sandbar, and this continued over a 2 to 3 day period, but it does run aground. Interestingly, he tells the story of Mr. Alfred Brown, the man who is living there at the end of Brown's Landing, tells about him and a friend going aboard, and he gets down in the hull of the ship. His friend, apparently the Union was coming, and the account is that one of the Union officers actually walked up and looked down in the hole where he was sitting, did not see him, and leaves, and later his friend comes back and picks him up. So one of the stories here about that. And so he said that there were these blockade runners. And then the other one he mentions is the Ranger. And most of us some of us, I remember at one time it was visible from the ocean front, right there, out in the ocean. It was actually in the ocean, the Ranger was. The Ranger, the blockade runner Ranger was a new ship. It was built in England. It comes over, it came by way of Bermuda, loaded its cargo, picked up a pilot, and he leaves Bermuda, makes it, comes in at Myrtle's Inlet, South Carolina. During the night, moves on up. The Ranger's crew beached the vessel, set fire to the ship before they escaped to the beach to prevent the Federal gunboats from salvaging the cargo there. And it goes on to say that Mr. John, and they would go out fishing, and on low tide, you could see part of the Ranger, still, showing. But of course, now with the hurricanes and everything, it's just totally no longer there. Let's go on down to something else a little more interesting. He continues to talk about the Yankee blockade steamers, and while we were eating oysters, one passing about a mile of us, so they're on the beach strand, he said, we're eating oysters. One passes within a mile of us, but we're too busy to pay any attention to it. I love the seashore, he said. There's always something new to see and strange shells to gather. Here, he said, I met the wrecker's daughter. That's a term that we need to do some research on. And what is wrecker? WRECKERS, the wrecker's daughter. And he said she was an ungainly, red-haired lass with a toothbrush in her mouth, dipping stuff. But then her mother gave us genuine coffee and good oysters until I felt like the girl did not look half as bad as first sight. He said they didn't get home from night. Well, you know, that could have been one of my ancestors. If she was redheaded, because I know my father was redheaded. His mother was redheaded. I had a cousin that was a strawberry blonde, a real red. I got a nephew that's got red hair, so I figured, well, maybe that was who he ran into when he saw this gainly lass sucking on a toothbrush. Now, they were also called chew sticks. I had never heard it called a chew stick. I figured you have to have some type of woody stem like sassafras. This came off of a sweet William shrub or something I had there. I just ran out and got something in the yard to sort of show it to you. But they would pound out and chew out till it became where and this was the end they used for the toothbrush, and there's the toothpick on the other end. And so it's called a chew stick. And said there were twigs, they had two uses, as I said, and one, they made it as a toothpick. They were also used by the ancient Egyptians, Chinese, and it goes back to the story of the chew stick. So here's this young lady that he meets. Things do improve because he's going to soon go to the house of the Mercers, and they're a little more up in society than this lass here. And so he said they're out of forage for feeding the animals. They're feeding them at this time on unshelled rice. And they said that was not good for them. It's hard for them to digest. And he mentions about the ticks have arrived in good force. They go to the coast a few days later after meeting that ungainly red-headed lass with a toothbrush in her mouth. They go back to the coast again, and this time they get a wagon load of oysters. He said the Yankees tried to reach us with shells from their boat, but they could not do so. And so the ships out on the ocean firing back to the land side. He said we had an oyster roast that night, and Jess Wharton, here he appears again, and myself each ate 80 oysters, but they were small and we were hungry. They go into town, into Wilmington, they get forage for the horses, they pick up their blankets, they pick up a pair of shoes from the quartermaster. And now we're in the year I had defined as 1863, so now he's moved back a year, and he's telling now. And in February 15th, this is a place where he meets the Mercer family. And so he went to the post office at Supply that was kept at the home of Mr. Mercer. He said, I saw a house full of young ladies. This is by far the most intelligent family I have seen in this country outside of Smithfield. He said they had a nice library and they loaned me the Vicar of Wakefield. Now, this is John did some research to figure out who this Mercer family was. There were a lot of ladies, there were 4 or 5 girls, and there were also 4 or 5 boys. And so it was a big family. It was John W. Mercer. And in 1860, he's listed in the Town Creek area. I was talking with Meg and we kind of figured out, I think I figured out where they are, right where Pauline lives and was talking about. There's a cemetery called the John Redmond Mercer Cemetery. And this John is buried there and his father. So you would assume that they're right there together. The census records list the Redmond. The next household is John's. The next household is Christopher, who was another brother. And so they were all there within that area. He owned 600 acres at that time. And in 1860, though, his personal property was valued at over $17,000. His land was valued at 3,500. So 600 acres, you can figure that out. But also living in the home was a man from Germany by the name of Henry Adams. And he was a bookkeeper. He was also the postmaster at what was then called New Supply. Even though he has it here listed as supply, by looking at records and figuring out the time, it had to, the post offices were in existence at New Supply, and its supply, it has to be the one there. Not only was Henry Adams, he was a bookkeeper, he was the postmaster, also one of John Mercer's daughters, Sophie, who was in the house, I guess one of those beautiful ladies that he saw, those young ladies that he saw. She also was postmaster for a time at New Supply. And then also in the home was a D.P. Henson, Kenson from Virginia. He was a school teacher. And so I'm assuming then that that's the reference that it's referring back to being an intelligent. And so then he moves back into going to Wilmington. He sees that the Advance is in. He says the Advance has 1/3 of our goods, and that was the textbooks. So naturally, he was not only serving in the war, but he's also doing his own business. And so his textbook industry was now he's in Wilmington. The boat has come in, the Advance has come in, and got about 1/3 of our goods for the printing company. He said, I slept out under an ambulance, and we know that those were the medical wagons that traveled around. And it snowed during the night, covered us fully 3 inches. It was very cold. And then he talks about going back to Wilmington again and spending a restless night at the hotel. He said, I rose early and went through the market, which was a sad looking place for a hungry man. Don't see how they live here. Said he's paid $16 for supper, lodging, and breakfast. And then he goes on to mention again another Austrian event, and I found something written in one of the books that I had not come across before. Fort Campbell, you know where Fort Caswell is? You come 1 mile toward Oak Island, keep moving away from Fort Caswell toward Oak Island. 1 mile away was Fort Campbell, and that's where Wesley's company was stationed there. But I read this about Fort Campbell. They actually kept an oyster boat there for the use of the sailors and soldiers to use. An oyster boat was maintained at Fort Campbell to supply the men with shellfish that were so abundantly nearby. And that was in Dr. Lawrence Lee's History of Brunswick County. So their diet was all about oysters, wasn't it? And so he goes again, finally gets a furlough, he gets to go home, he goes to the coast, he picks up some oysters to take home. The horse boats, he says, he said, one Yankee vessel inside Gregory's old horse Aram, threw me over his head in the sand and got away from me, and I had to walk 8 miles to camp and lost my oysters and my temper. And so poor fella, but that's what happened then as he was moving toward that way. And then he mentions a lot about over in Wilmington. They move over that way to our campaign. And he mentions out around Carolina Beach, that area. He said he's now in, Carolina Beach area. They haven't named the camp yet, he said. We went to a fishery on the river and saw them hauling a seine. Seine's the nets that bring in the fish. It's hard work, but good pay. They were catching hickory shad, mullets, catfish, flounders, hogfish, and stars, and a small sturgeon. And he mentions that. Then he actually goes fishing one day in April. So weather, I guess, is warming up. He said we went fishing with hooks in the river, but there were no bites. And then they were able to see the Venus and the Heap, and these were two other ships that had been blockade runners had destroyed, but they were still evident. He said, I took a bath in the salt water and was washed off the deck. He actually goes on board, he says, one of the ships. And he said, I decided to take a bath in salt water and was washed off the deck. And I came near being drowned. He said, I shall not bathe in a vessel again. I'm going to take to the open seas. And he has a fine breakfast of fish the next morning, though. And mentions on again, he just keeps fishing away. They do return back to Battery Anderson. He married his first wife was Martha Purvis, and he called her Miss Maddie. And he mentions in here, he said, I rode down to the battery. He said it was a good sand battery, had one heavy gun, had a good letter from Miss Maddie. And so I thought, who's Miss Maddie? And I found eventually that it was his wife, Martha. But notice what he says. The mosquitoes are very troublesome, and if they grow worse, if they grow worse as the weather gets warmer, we can't live here. So he was having some problems. One thing about, and I'll close with this little incident about the sweet potatoes. He said, we may think that cooking for our families is like cooking for an army, but not when we look at just the number of sweet potatoes that were required to feed the Confederate troops. This is an advertisement that was in the Wilmington paper, and they were soliciting sweet potatoes. And this was in 1861, so get your date there just at the beginning. Proposals are invited for the furnishing of sweet potatoes for the troops in the following quantities and for the following places. Confederate Point, they need 275 bushels per month. At Fort Johnston, Brunswick, 500 bushels per month. Wilmington, they need 275 bushels per month. He says parties proposing, so anybody that was interested in supplying those sweet potatoes will state your price that you're going to charge per bushel, but you got to deliver them to Wilmington. You got to do it semi-weekly. And if it's necessary for bags or barrels or boxes to be used to transport the sweet potatoes in, then you're expected to furnish those also. Okay. A little bit about James Washington Albright.